Today, I'm showing the tools and setup I use for sourdough baking. These are the proofing baskets I use to shape and support the dough during fermentation. I also use a temperature-controlled folding proofer. This step is completely optional, but it helps create stable conditions for the starter and dough to ferment properly. For this loaf, I'm using my homemade sourdough starter. I combine 100 grams of active starter with 350 grams of water and 500 grams of strong bread flour with more than 13% protein. I mix everything together until no dry flour remains, then leave the dough to rest for autolyse. Next, I measure 10 grams of salt and 10 grams of water. I dissolve the salt in the water before adding it to the dough. We're moving on to the second dough, which will be a more experimental version. For this dough, I'm using 100 grams of Levito Madre starter. Then I add 380 grams of water, 500 grams of flour, and about 1 tablespoon of whole wheat flour. Just like before, I mix everything together and leave the dough to rest for 1 hour of autolyse. For the second dough, I use 25 grams of water and 10 grams of salt. I mix them together well before adding them to the dough. Next, I'll show you how I feed my starters after taking them out of the refrigerator. For the Levito Madre starter, I use 50 grams of starter, 100 grams of flour, and 50 grams of water. I mix everything well, then shape the dough into a ball. I usually feed my starter once every 5 days while keeping it refrigerated. I also feed it again about 6 to 7 hours before baking to make sure it becomes active and strong enough for fermentation. I flatten it slightly, roll it up, and make cross-shaped cuts on top. This is the feeding method I use for my Levito Madre starter. For my own sourdough starter, I use a 1-2-2 feeding ratio. Before mixing the dough and feeding my starter, I pour boiling water over all of my containers and tools to make sure everything is perfectly clean. 1 hour has passed, and now I'm adding the salt to both doughs. For the first dough, I add 10 grams of water mixed with 10 grams of salt. For the second dough, I add 25 grams of water and 10 grams of salt. I also add flax seeds to the second dough, about 1 tablespoon. I mix everything thoroughly and place the dough into a temperature-controlled proofer set to 26 degrees Celsius. This helps maintain stable fermentation conditions throughout the process. Over the next 2 hours, I'll perform a series of folds every 30 minutes. Today, I'm also using baking stones to create steam inside the oven, since my oven does not have a built-in steam function. Now the dough is ready for shaping. A total of 9 hours has passed from the initial mixing stage to the shaping process. First, I pre-shape each dough into a round ball and leave them to rest on the bench for 30 minutes. Now I'm shaping the dough and placing it into proofing baskets for one final hour of fermentation. I also preheated the baking stone for 45 minutes before placing the bread into the oven. On the lower rack, I have additional heated stones that I pour water onto in order to create steam inside the oven. For scoring, I use a special bread lame. This is our experimental loaf. It will be baked directly on the baking stone without a Dutch oven or baking vessel. Now for the second loaf. To bake this bread, I'll need a few ice cubes, a preheated cast iron Dutch oven with a lid, and parchment paper. I carefully transfer the dough into the fully heated cast iron pot, place a few ice cubes underneath the parchment paper, and send it into the oven. For the first loaf, the one baked directly on the stone, I bake it at 250 degrees Celsius for 20 minutes. Then reduce the temperature to 230 degrees Celsius and continue baking for another 15 minutes. The second loaf is baked at 250 degrees Celsius for 20 minutes with the lid on, followed by 15 minutes without the lid. In the end, I noticed a big difference between the two baking methods. The loaf baked directly on the stone turned out delicious, but it didn't develop the same level of oven spring and expansion. The second loaf, baked inside the fully preheated cast iron Dutch oven, achieved a much stronger oven spring and a far more open structure. The crust, the rise, and the overall shape turned out beautifully. This may honestly be one of my favorite sourdough loaves so far. Thank you for baking with me, and don't forget to subscribe. I'm also comparing the hydration levels and starter types used for both loaves. The flaxseed loaf was made with Levito Madre starter and contains 405 grams of water and 500 grams of flour, making it a higher hydration dough. The other loaf was made with my homemade sourdough starter and contains 360 grams of water and 500 grams of flour. This is the loaf that achieved the best oven spring and rose beautifully inside the cast iron Dutch oven.